the term Jamstack was originally coined by Matt Billman, who's the CEO of Netlify, back in 2016. And the reason he came up with this term is before that, we called this static sites, right? Static sites sounds really old, and like you can't do much with it. So the term became problematic. People thought like, you know, yeah, that sounds good for my blog or maybe for a marketing site, but I can't build real applications on that. So he came up with this term, Jamstack, to kind of try and change the perception of these kinds of sites built with the tools. So he wrote this manifesto, which he posted at jamstack.org, and that was really all it was a one-page manifesto that introduced the term. And as you can see there, it says, so Jam stands for JavaScript, APIs, and markup. So literally every article since then has been, oh, JavaScript, APIs, and markup. JavaScript, APIs, and markup. It's going to take a while, guys. I'm going to go through all of them. JavaScript, APIs, and markup. JavaScript, APIs, and markup. There you go again. Same thing. OK, I'm not literally going to go through them all, but you get the idea, right? So what's the problem with this? Right? The problem is that nearly every modern site uses JavaScript, APIs, and markup, OK? So imagine I am a big PHP developer. I love PHP. I build all my websites using PHP, right? So does my PHP site use JavaScript? Yeah, I use tons of JavaScript on my front end, of course, right? Does it use API? Sure. I'm actually using the Contentful PHP SDK to call their API, and I'm getting content from their API, right? Does it use markup? Yeah, I mean, PHP is markup, HTML is markup, right? So I get it. PHP is Jamstack, right? So, but yeah, it's not. It's not Jamstack, right? So this got me thinking. I'm like, okay, what is it that really differentiates Jamstack from other types of web development? Like, what are the problem? What is the thing that is kind of hard for people when they come building Jamstack sites? That's kind of hard for them to understand, to wrap their heads around. So I think I know what it is, and that's what I really want to talk about today. Understanding rendering in Jamstack. So I was like, what you call like a cold open maybe or something. But this to me is like what really differentiates Jamstack is you have to think about when you render something. And so rendering becomes kind of a complicated problem. And it's not really the JavaScript APIs and markup that differentiate it because that is in every site. It is thinking about when you render something at what point. So a little bit about me, real quick. I am a developer experience manager at LaunchDarkly. I've been doing Jamstack stuff since 2013, since before we called it Jamstack. I even wrote a book back, what was it, 5 years ago, Ray? We released a book called Working with Static Sites in O'Reilly, and we're currently updating that to the Jamstack book, which is now from Manning. And I am the editor of the Jamstack newsletter, which is from Cooper Press, which will come out tomorrow in case you're interested in subscribing, keeping up with the latest Jamstack news. And again, I said I work for LaunchDarkly. We do feature management and feature flags, so it's not Jamstacky stuff, although you can use it on your Jamstack site, obviously. And if you think feature flags is like feature flags as a service, sounds kind of like deceptively simple, but it's actually really, really powerful. So please check it out. And again, if you're interested in the Jamstack book from Manning, it is available now. We technically finished it. Ray's writing it with me as well. Technically finished it. But you can get the early access version right now, and the print version should be out soon if you actually like print books. So I want to take a little trip back to 1997. I'll explain why 97 in a bit. So 97, those of you who were around back then, Bill Clinton was president. We thought our politics was messed up, huh? So Elton John had his Candle in the Wind, which was sad because Princess Diana died that year. We had this movie called Titanic, which had this astronomical budget of $200 million. Can you believe it? And people thought that was insane. And I built my first web page in 1997. This is not actually my web page. I'm not Arvin, but this is basically what my web page looked like. I uploaded this page to AT&T, and because they had this like site hosting thing, and I actually won a contest for uploading this page there, and they gave me this camera. It was an Olympus camera that was $599 back in 1997, and it had a 1024 by 768 resolution, and that was the highest of any consumer-grade digital camera at the time. Kick ass, right? So then I got involved with this programming language called Cold Fusion. So the web had already kind of moved on from like your CGI scripts and stuff like that a little bit, and we were doing things like this with dynamic sites with Cold Fusion, which was from Alaire at the time. So I got started around this time with Cold Fusion version 4.5, and that's what really got me into web development. But the whole thing, like, web pages were basically rendered the same way. Every web page basically worked the same way. A user would request a page, the request would be routed to a web server. Web server would either serve up static HTML, or in the case of Cold Fusion, it'd be route the request over to the application server, which would then render the request, send it back as HTML. And for those of you thinking like, well, and CSS and JavaScript, no, not really. There was no CSS, really, at the time, or at least none that we were using. And JavaScript was not really a language that anybody used for anything other than, hover buttons and stuff like that. So anyway, but the mental model of this whole thing is very simple, right? Like, static pages sat in a web server, but they were not really rendered in any real sense. You'd hand code them, right? And everything else was rendered by a web application server. So this was what we now call SSR, because we got to give like fancy acronyms to everything nowadays. So now we call it SSR, and everybody can pretend like it's something new and fancy that we haven't been doing for 30 years. And I'm going to throw a lot of acronyms at you today. So then static site generators kind of came around. They were around for a while, but it really was popularized with Jekyll in around 2013. So they came around and they would be rendered. You'd actually do, this changed the way you rendered things a little bit. So static page was rendered during a build process, right? Initially, this would happen when I started, I would do this on my machine, and I would still FTP things up to a web server, and I'd still have Apache and stuff like that. I even had little tools that made it easier to FTP things, so I didn't have to manually move files over and things every time I ran a new build, but it was still kind of the same process. It just wasn't hand-coded. We'd mesh all these pieces together using the static site generator to render out the pages on build. And then, things started to change with Netlify and GitHub Pages, where when I'm no longer rendering things on my machine, I'm actually pushing them to GitHub, and then they get rendered on a build server out there. And we started to kind of call this pre-rendering, right? Which we still kind of do, right? Say, instead of statically generating, it's we're pre-rendering pages and pushing them out to a CDN, which is kind of where Netlify started to change things, right? Now I'm not serving from a web server, I'm actually serving from a CDN. That makes it that's part of what makes Jamstack really fast and really secure, is the pages are static and they're served from a CDN. So that's kind of one of the unique things that started to change what Jamstack was. That's a key thing in Jamstack, actually, is that all this stuff is deployed to a CDN. So we kind of sat there for a while. That's where Jamstack was, and nothing really changed for a number of years. And then this little framework came out and started to change how we had to think about things. So Next.js, one of the key things about Next.js, it started out as purely server-side rendered React framework, right? And then they started to allow you to build static pages. But the interesting thing was you could mix static routes and server-side rendered routes. So you could have a site that was primarily static that might have a few routes that were server rendered, or vice versa. You could have a site that was primarily server rendered, but then have some routes that were rendered as static, right? And the way this worked, under the covers, when you create something like your get get server-side props. Like the reason I can deploy this to Netlify and other places that host static sites is that it actually takes that and it converts it over to a serverless function and deploys it. So like it's the same thing in essence as for those of you who have used Netlify before. If I create a Netlify function, for instance, that actually deploys over to AWS as a Lambda, right? It's the same basic thing. This is handled by the framework. It's done automatically as soon as I deploy it to Netlify. This actually gets deployed as a serverless function over to AWS the same way. So essentially, you have a bunch of little microservices that are made up of all the server-side rendering of your pages, right? There's no node server running there, other than obviously on AWS for your serverless function. But anyway, so that's how that works. It did cause us a lot of angst, some of which we really quite haven't gotten over yet. We're still debating what does it mean if I can do if I can do server-side rendering and deploy it to Netlify, and so that's pushed out to a CDN. Is it still Jamstack even though it's mostly server rendered? And we're kind of continuously debating this. Kind of debating it into the ground is kind of pointless. So I made things a little bit complicated. And then we added incremental static regeneration, another Next.js thing. So basically, it's a different type of rendering. What it does is it sits somewhere kind of between your kind of straight static pre-rendered pages and SSR. So what it essentially does is that the first time somebody hits that root or that page, it's gonna, if it hasn't already been pre-rendered as static, it's actually gonna call out to the server, render that page, push it back up, and then from then on, anybody else subsequently who requests that will get the static version of the page. So there's a little bit of a hit for that first person when it first gets rendered, but everybody else gets the static page as if I'd pre-built it during the build process, right? So this was an innovation was important because as more big companies started to adopt Jamstack for larger sites, the build times particularly, and I'm not knocking it because I use some of these frameworks, but the build times particularly for the JavaScript-based, framework-based static site generators like Next.js would get really, really slow. So in this case, it would speed up the build process because I wasn't generating the entire site every time. I'm only generating some of it. The other interesting part about ISR is that it allows you to have a timeout where the cache will be invalidated. So effectively, like I can say, okay, every hour or even every minute or wherever I want, if somebody hits it again, I will regenerate it, push it back up as static and serve it. It's kind of like a heavy caching in a way. But essentially after that, it gets re-rendered and then the page will be served as static until the timeout hits again and we do the process all over again. So this was something that actually Netlify philosophically didn't like. They didn't like the idea that you could invalidate these pages because they have this thing that they call atomic deploys, which means like that that when you move back, like from you cancel a deploy and you move back a deploy, that it's self-contained, right? And that doesn't happen with ISR, especially with this invalidation. You don't know what the state of your site was at that point. So they didn't like the fact that they didn't like that fact, so they came up with their own thing. They said that, they argued that you can no longer have immutable deploys, it'd lead to hard to debug errors and a number of other things. So they came up with their own thing called distributed persistent rendering. And it's slightly different than incremental static regeneration, but it's really, really not that different. The primary difference really is that the DPR version only ever renders once. So as soon as that person hits that page, we're gonna render it, we're gonna push it up, and it actually becomes part of the build. And from then on, anybody who comes subsequently will get the static version of that page until I run another full build, right? So there's no point at which that page gets invalidated. It's, until I run a new full build, and then the process will start over again, which allows them to actually, since it gets pushed up as part of the build is still immutable. When I move back to it, it's still there, right? As opposed to the ISR version, which gets invalidated. Then Gatsby, more recently, had released Gatsby 4, and they added something called deferred static generation, which is basically DPR in Gatsby. Because we like to throw so many different acronyms at you, I told you. So now we have a little fight between Versal, with who makes Next.js, Netlify, and Gatsby each having their own version of the same thing, which honestly, I'm just like, it's just deferred rendering. That's what I call it. I think it's the one that it makes the most sense. All we're saying is we're not gonna render this during the build. We're gonna render it at some point later when it gets first requested. And that's the end of it. We don't need so many fancy acronyms that honestly I think are more confusing than helpful. So let's review. We have, We have static rendering, or pre-rendering, or SSG. Some people just call it SSG, whatever you want to call it, it's fine. In which the content is rendered on the build server and then deployed to the CDN. And we have server-side rendering, or SSR, where the content is rendered on each request for every user. And then we have deferred rendering, or DPR, ISR, ISG, whatever you want to call it, where the content is rendered the first time it's requested, and then subsequent requests will actually receive the static page. This all seems kind of complex, and honestly, I think it kind of is. So I want to kind of go over some of the best practices of when to use what when you're developing a Jamstack application. So static rendering. This is really where you should start. I have this kind of way I think about Jamstack. I talk about it as static first. And part of that is about the fact that it doesn't have to, not everything needs to be static. Jamstack isn't about all the pages having to be pre-rendered and static, right? You can use an SSR route in a Jamstack site. It doesn't mean it's not Jamstack. That's all silliness to me. But you should start with static. You say, look at a page and say, can I pre-render this? If I can pre-render it, I should pre-render it, right? And that doesn't have to apply to the entirety of a page. Remember, I can use SSR with hydration, or I can use client-side rendering and actually enhance a page after the fact. So if a majority of a page can be pre-rendered, go ahead and pre-render it. I think, and the reason I say this is because that whole mental model that I talked about with that SSR kind of, the traditional model is much easier than thinking about okay, can I pre-render these pieces and stuff? It's easier to say, oh, I could just render every page for every request on the server. Simple. But then you kind of, you give up a lot of the benefits of Jamstack, right? So server-side rendering, use it judiciously. So what I mean by that is again, overusing server-side rendering is kind of giving up some of the things that we are adopting Jamstack for. That's, that you don't have to go back to the server on every request. You don't, we have that security and things like that are kind of built into the Jamstack model. So I try and say use it carefully where you need to use it, but go ahead and use it. I'm okay with that. It doesn't. Like I said, we get into these debates about what the heck is Jamstack with this SSR stuff, and it's nobody's sitting around at their computer saying oh, I want to build this site, but and I want this page really should be server rendered, but but then is it really Jamstack? So I can't do that. No, that's silly, right? You're going to do what you need to do to build your application, and who cares if it is or it isn't Jamstack? But again, try and use it judiciously. I mostly use it for personalized content, user-generated content, or content that's going to change really, really frequently. Then use server-side rendering. Deferred rendering is really for when you have lots and lots of pages. So this is really a solution for sites, large sites, right? So the whole point of deferred rendering is really, I don't want to have to render, let's say I'm an e-commerce site and I have tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of pages for each product. I don't want to have to render all of those in the build and have the build take forever. And in fact, a lot of those pages, let's say 70% of my products don't get that much traffic. So let's render the 30% that are high traffic pages, and the other 70% get rendered when they get hit for the first time. and it can save you, quite a bit of time in the build process. And, build processes cost money as well, so that's a big deal. So, again, focus on the high traffic, pre-render the high traffic pages, defer render the low traffic pages. You can actually use this for user-generated content. So let's, as an example, and this isn't always a good solution for user-generated content, but you can. So let's say I had a form and I allow somebody to create a profile page, and they put all their profile information, and that goes in, and it gets sent out to my, serverless function that writes it out to wherever I'm writing it out, like FaunaDB or whatever. Then they go hit the profile page. I actually call that same thing, render it as static, and now it's done. It's part of the build, right? So you can do user-generated content that way using this deferred rendering, but it's only going to be useful in certain scenarios. It's not for something that is going to be changing all the time. This is just something like I can actually then statically generate that page and render it out. So, okay. So I got one more thing. So we got edge rendering, which is kind of a new thing it's actually in beta in most cases, in most places that have this, but it is something you also want to consider. So in this case, rendering is still done via like a serverless function, but this serverless function is deployed off to a CDN. And so sometimes in certain environments, there are limitations like, I think in AWS you can only run certain node. Well, it depends on which version on AWS if you're deploying to CloudFront functions or Edge at Lambda at Edge. But anyway, the point is there's sometimes on certain environments you have limitations of what you can do. So it can't do everything that I can do in a normal serverless function because it's deployed to the CDN. You can actually render the entire response at the edge if you want. So like for instance in Cloudflare workers, they have examples showing you actually hitting the CDN and then the CDN just returning the page for you. You can build a whole site that way. I don't know if that's a recommended way you do anything, but you can also modify the response. So the thing is you can actually catch the request coming in and it hits the function at the CDN level. And then you can do something with the request on its way in, or you can get the response coming back and modify that. So like as another example would be like if I want to check if somebody's logged in and I want to modify the content on the page if they are logged in, I can actually get the request back, check to see if they have the cookie, and if they have the cookie, modify that request before they ever get the page. Which is kind of cool because it gets rid of that flash of original content. So you all know when you go to a page and you suddenly the login example is one, you'll see it say login and then for a second, and then all of a sudden it shows, oh, it has my profile information because it checked this all client side. In this case, we get rid of that because it's all getting rendered at the edge and modified during the response or in the request. So I can do that without having that content flash. It's also extremely fast, so I think this is where a lot of stuff, like a lot of the innovation in Jamstack is headed towards this kind of edge rendering stuff, but not everybody offers it yet fully. Like Netlify has it in beta, Cloudflare has it, and Versal just released it in beta as well, so which leads me to what works where. Not all of these things work equally across all the different providers. I'm thinking like, we're talking about the people who do these kind of deployment, like Netlify, Versal, you have Cloudflare has their Cloudflare pages, you have Microsoft has their, what is Microsoft's one again? They call it static web apps. Right, so not all of these things have their own. They all have their own versions of the same thing. Basically, it's like Netlify on whatever other platform. Is how I like to think of it because I've been using Netlify forever. So static rendering, obviously that works everywhere. I can do this anywhere. That's the whole point of the whole thing. I can pre-render a page and deploy it to any one of those services is going to work. I could even GitHub Pages, for instance, I can pre-render and deploy to GitHub Pages or anywhere. They're static. It's easy. Server-side rendering, so most vendors do have support for server-side rendering in these. So the nice thing is this is handled like mostly in the framework. So if they support whatever version you want to use of the framework, like if you're using Next or Nuxt, Nuxt 3 added in the ability to both do server-side rendering routes and static routes. Before it was like you had to choose one for the whole site, or the other. You couldn't mix and match. Now you can mix and match with Nuxt 3. So if they support that version, then it supports that feature. So so Next.js, Nuxt, Gatsby, 11D all work on like Netlify. They work on Vercel, and most of these they work on Cloudflare, etc. And you'll get the server-side rendering pretty much out of the box, and you won't have to do anything. Just upload your site. Check it into GitHub, how it'll get deployed, and those functions will get sent out for you. So the deferred rendering is a little bit of a different story. Netlify has it, but they only support their version of it. So if you use Next.js and you have incremental static regeneration with a timeout, then that's actually going to be deployed as just as a regular server-side rendered page. It's not actually ever going to serve it up from cache. It's always going to server-side render it on Netlify. But if you deploy that same site to Vercel, then it will actually work the way you expect it to. Gatsby Cloud obviously is just for Gatsby, but they support their version, which is basically just the same as Netlify's for Gatsby. So like I said, ISR with revalidate is on Vercel only. And one question I get sometimes is like, is there a bit of vendor lock-in on this stuff? And for the most part, the answer is no. There's not vendor lock-in because I'm not actually doing anything specific to Netlify. I'm just, for example, building a Next.js site, and all that stuff happens auto-magically behind the scenes. Like it gets deployed as the functions and stuff auto-magically behind the scenes. So as long as they support that version of the framework, you're good to go. I'm not locked in. I could then deploy that to Vercel and it would work the same, and so on. So there's not like a lot of vendor lock-in with this. All right. Oh, yeah. And I apologize. This presentation was shorter than I thought it was. So the edge rendering, I do want to talk a little bit more about that. So so edge rendering, again, Netlify has this in a private beta. You actually have to request, and I have not seen anybody actually, not myself, nor Ray, nor anybody, able to get into their private beta for this. So I have not used it. I don't know how it works. Vercel did with the latest release of Next 12, is it 12? I think it's 12. That came out, what was it, like a month ago at Next.js Conf. They released this in beta. I can't remember what they called it, but basically their version of it, you can write it into, you basically write it in as part of the framework, and it'll automatically deploy those as edge functions for you, which is really, really cool. Cloudflare has it as well. I don't believe Cloudflare has any way to automatically do it. You'd actually have to write these as Cloudflare workers and then hook them to your Pages site, but actually works great. And Cloudflare is really, really interesting because Cloudflare has a HTML rewriter, which makes it really easy to intercept those requests when they're coming back. And it's almost like think of it like jQuery DOM manipulation. You can actually, traverse the DOM really easily on the request that's coming back and modify that response really easily. So I really, really like what they're doing there. But again, it doesn't automatically deploy those for you. You have to kind of manage that separately, but it is really, really cool. Definitely worth checking out. So, I talked really fast, and I apologize. It's a short presentation. But, go ahead and go forth and render. I know this is about rendering movies. It's not about rendering Jamstack sites. But if you use certain frameworks, it could be about rendering Jamstack sites that take forever. I have one I maintain regularly that I deal with that every day. But since this was a lot faster than I thought it was, I'm happy to answer anybody's questions. Yeah.
So I'll preface this question with, I'd never heard the term jam until I saw this session show up on the
Sure.
And you started in 1997 with your timeline, and you mentioned static pages over and over and over. I have been completely lost during this entire session because I don't understand why for a static page I need a build, I need to invalidate the cache on it. What am I missing?
So the question is why do I need all this to generate static pages? Yeah. So the basically a static site generator will take markup, like I'll have templates and I'll have markdown and I'll have other things, and it takes all this stuff and it builds it together so then it's to generate out those pages. So it's really easy to build these pages, like using all the templates, using all the features of the framework to do all kinds of really advanced things like have server-side. No. So when you push, you're not doing full rendering every time. When I push my changes to GitHub, those get pushed, like Netlify has a hook that looks for those changes. It's going to pull those changes in, and it will run through rendering all the pages for you, building that whole site out, and then yeah.
It's sending something back to the server, and the server's re-rendering the entire.
No, it's not. That would be server-side rendering. That's not, yeah. So no, we're not re-rendering the entire page. So if a user comes to the site, they click the widget, usually that's going to trigger. That's where the JavaScript part of JavaScript APIs and markup was, because we can do these dynamic things via JavaScript, right? That's why that term came about, because we could do it doesn't have to be static. It's still dynamic. But all that, that would be done client-side, and then I might redirect you to another page saying, oh, it's done. Or I might use client-side JavaScript to update the page and say, okay, add it to your cart or whatever, things like that, right? So it's not sending a whole other request and re-rendering the page. In fact, most of the time, these pages are completely static. So I built e-commerce sites where all the pages are basically static. All the interaction with everything except, even the cart is all done client-side, or you can use some of these kind of fancy solutions to do some server-side stuff that way. Like say for the cart page, you might render that server-side as opposed to doing client-side rendering on that. But I'm not re-rendering the entire page. The whole build is put out onto the CDN, and you're getting static pages that are enhanced with occasional server-side routes or occasional client-side rendering and so on. Does that make more sense?
I don't think I'm any clearer on it. So does it make sense to use a client front-end framework in this?
Some of them, so yes, it does. It doesn't always, right? So Next.js uses React, right? And Nuxt uses Vue. And there's a whole set of tools, and all of them use their own frameworks. Well, it's static in that the pages are actually pre-rendered. So they're using client. I'm not sure I understand. Right. That page with the faucet is static. It's pre-rendered. It's sitting there on a CDN. It's a static HTML file that you get. So the same person that clicks that next page gets exactly the same thing. They're not hitting a web server. They're just served up a static file.
So then I buy a washer, and now there just happens to be a pre-rendered page that shows my faucet and my washer on it.
If you go to your cart, yeah, that's good. If you go to your cart and it says, and that's the personalized content, that's either done via client-side rendering or server-side rendering. But let's say the page that showed you the faucet where you clicked add to cart, static. Go to the cart. Some of them will be client-side rendered carts. So the page is static and I fill in the cart client-side, or that cart page might actually be server rendered, but everything around it is static. All the other pages around it are static. So like all the pages with the products, static. Cart, server render.
Is this like a highly optimized system for something that's got just millions of things and it's...
No, is it a highly optimized system for? No, it's basically a way of building sites that's super. It makes it secure because most of these things are static, right? So it's hard to hack into. It's sitting on a CDN. There's no web server. There's no application server. There's no database server, generally speaking. Like, they're super fast because it's on a CDN. There's a whole. I mean, I can go into it, but there's a whole lot of reasons why I and other people love to use Jamstack. But those would be the main things. I mean, so. Most of this is as I said, most of your site is going to be static. Most of the pages are pre-built, and HTML, CSS, and JavaScript are deployed off to the CDN. Those are served up real fast when somebody requests the page. But you can enhance these things with server rendering, with all these other kinds of rendering to be able to do very dynamic things with static assets. Yeah. Anybody else have? Yeah, over there.
Can you give examples of popular sites that use this as a technique?
Oh God, there's a lot of, and I do have a whole section in the chapter in the book on this. I think Nike uses it. Whoever the parent company that runs all like the Popeyes and all those restaurants, they have a ton of sites that use it. Who else, Ray? Trying to think of Ray's blog uses it. There's a lot of big companies that use it. I would suggest one of the best places to find those, especially when I was researching it, is Netlify and Vercel have case studies on a lot of these companies that they use them. Obviously, they pick the big names, but there's a ton of very, very big companies that use these. Gatsby has a ton of them too that use them. I mean, we actually launched Darkly. I don't know what most of our site, but there's chunks of our site that are on Gatsby. And I know lots of universities that use a lot of them too. And I mean, the thing is it's hard sometimes to figure out because it looks like a regular web page. There's nothing like that, it's HTML, right? So there's nothing that distinctly says this is built with this tool. And even tools like Eleventy don't even allow. Eleventy is another static site generator. So tools like Eleventy don't even allow you to figure out that it's built with Eleventy because it purposely hides the fact that it's built with Eleventy. So oftentimes you're hitting sites that use it and you don't have any idea, right? Because that's I think the great thing because it feels like a regular dynamic website to you. It doesn't feel like these are being served up as static files. Everything feels dynamic, but it is static. So, but yeah, like I said, Nike, the Popeyes company were the only ones that come to mind as because those were examples of the books. Huh?
It seems like scale and performance.
Yeah, performance really is the number one reason to use it. The pages are crazy fast. Particularly newer frameworks are actually trying to even take things like Next.js became really popular, and it's still fast compared to say server rendering all your pages and whatever PHP, .NET, whatever you're using. But we are shoving a whole client-side framework down on every single page. So newer frameworks like Astro and Eleventy are actually even doing things to try and reduce the amount of JavaScript you push down to the client, so that we only send JavaScript when that's needed for interactivity on the page, but every other page is actually just static HTML. So you get even faster. But yeah, I mean the other thing, honestly, I love the developer experience of it. Once you kind of get used to it, it's a lot of fun to build things with these tools. That is one of the things that drew me to it originally, and to be so much of what we build every day we don't have to do everything on the server. Like it's actually can be pre-built. Like there's so much of the web that's could be just served up as static and just add like interactivity. It's, you know, it's not suitable. It's not something I tell people, oh, everything should be Jamstack. There are plenty of things that don't make a lot of sense of Jamstack. There's, at this point in time, like you can pretty much build anything you want with Jamstack, but should it be Jamstack? Probably, you know, in some cases, probably not. Like if you have an interactive dashboard that's serving up data that's real time, like all the time, and lots of that's being rendered server side, then yeah, that may not make sense to convert that over to Jamstack. But if you have a lot of stuff, like if a lot of your content can be pre-rendered, then absolutely this is the way to go, in my opinion. Yeah?
I ran into an issue with Next and your image component.
Yeah.
The image component, you use Lambda on the edge to resize the image, which is great because it's source set and responsive. But when you're thinking about like a large background image, that first person that hit that page,
Yes.
hit because
Yeah.
start time and integration time. Curious if you've ever come across that or had a workaround or maybe a component.
So using, the question was about using the Next.js image component. This is, you're basically re-rendering, like rendering the image sizes and stuff. Yeah. I've had a lot of problems with that image component, I'll be honest. I flat out stopped using it because half the time it didn't seem to work right. I'd get errors or I'd get things that were slow that I didn't really want. So I oftentimes, like I've used the asset management stuff in other tools, which actually generally will generate those assets at build time. So the thing about Next.js is they generate that on the server, which is why you get that slowness. So I don't actually like that. Preferably, I would swap that out for Cloudinary, which I think is a better solution for handling assets like that, particularly if you have a lot of them. But again, that's adding another service that could end up adding another charge. But I think you'll find that you get better performance out of that, and you won't have that delay. And I found that image component, honestly, very, very hard to use and troublesome, so I just avoid it. But that's me personally. I know lots of people do use it. So, what's that? Yeah, you're not. I've talked to other people who use Next.js, and that image component is a pain in the butt. So, all right. Well, did anybody else have any questions before? I mean, oh. All right. Well, thank you all for coming. You get out a little early. Thanks.